Hey everyone, Nubkeks here and welcome to another Heroes of the Storm video. In today's one, we're diving into a blog post. This will probably be maybe in 2 or 3 parts because this is a long one by ChaosOS. I always get this wrong too. I pronounce it Chaos, but it's ChaosOS. He writes a really good series of blog posts called Math of the Storm, where he basically looks at, from a mathematical perspective, how a particular balance patch will affect the game. So let's say a hero's level 16 talent tier gets reworked. He'll sit down and work out, okay, well, looking at crunching the numbers, these are how the talents stack up against each other, and this is the situations where you pick them. It's one of the best blog posts I've ever read for, well, any game ever, actually. So I highly recommend you check out his stuff. Today we're looking at more of an opinion-based piece, I guess you would say, called Matchmaking and You, A Guide to Better Complaints. Which he published on Tempo Storm. So we'll go through the first part today, and yeah, probably 2 or 3 parts. We'll see how quickly we get through it, and I'll probably be sticking some footage, some random P2R footage, testing out probably Whitemane in the background. So yeah, I haven't picked it yet, so hopefully it's something to look at if you're interested. All right, well, let's dive into it. So he begins the article saying, the Heroes of the Storm subreddit periodically complains about all sorts of issues related to matchmaking or the game client, fundamental systems that run Heroes of the Storm. Understanding how these things actually work is an important prerequisite to addressing if you're talking about what you perceive as a problem, but have all the facts wrong. The devs will rightfully ignore what you're saying. So we're going to go in and look at the issues, and there's several bullet points here which make up the first portion of the article. That's what we're going to look at today. So first of all, balance issues. The Heroes of the Storm subreddit periodically complains about heavily about the state of balance in the game. To start, I've never known a competitive game where the community was genuinely happy with the state of balance, except for when new content had just released, so nothing broken had been found yet. Every single meta at some point falls into a rut, with a few dominant strategies forming tier 1, weaker strategies filling in a tier 2, and anything after that considered a meme or a very niche counter strategy. In tackling the first part of this paragraph, I think this is a really valid point. I actually think just looking at it in terms of game design and what makes video games fun. Having played several MOBAs, so I played quite a lot of League of Legends, obviously lots and lots of Heroes of the Storm, and then I dabbled a bit in Overwatch too. Obviously it's a first-person shooter, but it contains a lot of MOBA elements, and just playing other games throughout the years as well. I mean, we're going into a new World of Warcraft expansion right now, and I think you see the exact same sort of phenomenon happening here. I actually feel that the way that these games are designed, with so much content and so much complexity to them, oftentimes it is that newness factor that makes it fun. Like when I played League of Legends, even playing HOTS as well, the most fun time I've genuinely found in those games is when you first pick it up and you're learning it and you're just having a ton of fun playing the new heroes, trying something different all the time, unlocking all the new stuff, and just being kind of constantly surprised and constantly learning. I think that's probably the most fun section. And it's when you get to this, I actually think it's when you get to that super competitive stage that, certainly for me, things get a lot less fun, where you kind of know pretty much everything and it's all about refining the particular strategy. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting thought I had looking at this. I'd be curious to know what you guys think. But to go back to the main thrust of the paragraph, which is that every game, well, certainly every video game, I would say, is that, yeah, no one is ever fully happy. And if everyone is happy, it's just a matter of time until certain broken strategies are found or limitations are uncovered, and then things need to change. So I think that's totally correct. Going on with the post then, this is not to say metas can be more or less healthy. Metagames with a single tier 0 or S strategy are prima facie bad, and even metagames with multiple strong strategies can end up with a rock, paper, scissors solution, with all other strategies simply being weaker versions of the dominant rock, paper, or scissors. Relatively healthy metas almost never have more than 5 or so tier 1 strategies, with a multitude of tier 2 strategies to fill in underneath them that have some unique strength to differentiate themselves from one of the tier 1 strategies. Probably the biggest thing I have to say here is that when I look at Heroes of the Storm, I actually feel that for the most part, the role that strategy, and I mean like large scale, macro level strategy, has to play in the game is, for most players, almost non-existent, actually. To give you an example, it's something I would consider what I'll call a tempo strategy. And let me explain what I mean by that. But let's say you've got two teams, you're fighting each other, big team fight between two teams. And Team A has a stronger direct team fight than Team B. But for Team B, basically what they would want to do then is sort of a tempo strategy, which is for the first, let's say, 5 or 6 seconds of the team fight, we play very defensively and just try to mitigate and minimize the effectiveness of Team A's engage. And then in the next 5 or 6 seconds of the team fight, so after that short defensive period, then they want to go full aggressive. That is their moment to shine. Basically, what you're doing here is playing around the enemy team's cooldowns, right? They have a team fight power spike when they throw out that first rotation of cooldowns, and then you've got effectively a power trough once those cooldowns have been used and you're waiting for them to come back up again. So to give you, again, a simple example in actual game terms and HOTS, let's say Team A has Thrall and Raynor as their two main assassins, and Team B has a Maiev and a Jaina. So Team A, they run forwards, Thrall and Raynor run forwards, Raynor drops a Hyperion, Thrall drops an Earthquake. Thrall has his Wolf he can throw out, which roots. He's got a couple of charges of Chain Lightning ready to go. He's got Wind Fury, so he's going to burn all those at the start, let's say. Raynor goes in, burns Inspire, maybe burns his Penetrating Round, the knockback, so on and so forth. And Team B with Maiev and Jaina, the much smarter way to play that, again, just taking 2 heroes in each team, right, would be, okay, we'll just try to back off, try to survive for 5 or 6 seconds while all those abilities go off, just make them hurt as little as possible, and then we go in, right, and we save our stuff for that. So we wait basically 5 or 6 seconds, we just dodge, we play defensively, then we go in, we lock down probably Thrall, hopefully Raynor, but probably not possible. But let's say we'll certainly try to lock down Thrall and then blow him up with the Maiev lockdown and the Jaina burst damage, right? So that's, in my opinion, that's a very, very basic strategy, right? It's pretty basic. We're basically taking simply only looking at 2 heroes, 2 assassins on either team, and basically the synergistic strengths of each one and how those 2 would actually compare. What strategy should each team use putting them together? And that Team B should do a tempo type strategy. But here's the thing, right? Here's the question. At what point, at what level of play in Hero League would you realistically expect that in most, if not all of your matches, that your team and this is the crucial thing, right? That everyone on your team would be capable of understanding and enacting that particular strategy, and also that they're willing to do it as well. And I honestly, in my experience from coaching and looking at loads of games over lots of different levels of play and from playing lots myself, probably I'd have to say you wouldn't actually see that type of strategy being capable of being done regularly probably until about Grandmaster, being perfectly honest here. Around about the borderline of Grandmaster, at the most probably a bit down into Master, but yeah, that's probably about as far as I would push it. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is that I don't feel that strategy actually really plays all that much of a role oftentimes, or at least the strategies involved are incredibly basic in Heroes of the Storm, because it is a team-based game, and ultimately the big strategic play occurs on a team level, and simply having 5 people that are capable and willing, that have mastered their individual stuff and then are ready to work on the team stuff. It's pretty rare that happens. Or another example to give you would be that I think it's about 70% of players are ranked in either silver or gold in Hero League, right? That's where most people are. And here's the thing, from my experience, again, coaching players in silver and gold, and of course then observing all the other silver and gold players in those particular games that I've coached, very, very rarely do you actually get players at that level that would even understand what lanes that they are supposed to go in. So if you sat down with a typical silver or gold player and said, okay, Tomb of the Spider Queen, how do you distribute the lanes? Very often players wouldn't know. So for example, on Tomb of the Spider Queen, you'd run a solo lane bottom, 1 hero versus 1, and then you'd have a 4-man rotation. So basically 4 heroes sticking together, moving between mid and top, back and forth, trying to catch all the minions. That's the default, that's the basic. And I think a lot of the players wouldn't actually know that, or even if they do know that, they don't actually know how to enact that. And like I said, that is the default. that's not what you always go with. That's just the basic thing. That's the starting point. And then it becomes, when do we split heroes off? When do we want to go with actually a different laning setup? Who and when do we send to gank bot lane? What about the mercs, etc., etc.? All these other complicated things. If you haven't even got the basic stuff, I don't think you can really get the complicated stuff. And certainly if you don't get the basic stuff, you can't even pick the right heroes to actually make it work. So everything sort of on a strategic level kind of falls apart into chaos. So yeah, sorry if that's a bit of a depressing reflection on the game, but that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's certainly what my thoughts on it are after several years of analyzing this stuff. But let's continue on with the article, though, because I've probably been doing a lot more talking than I have been doing reading, which is probably a bad balance. So let's keep going here. Complicating this desire for metagame diversity is a desire for skill-testing gameplay that is fun and engaging. To cite a Magic the Gathering example, back in late 2010 and early 2011, there existed an overwhelmingly powerful deck named Caw-Blade, Squadron Hawk. This deck was so good that all other strategies ceased to be functional, with attempts to counter Caw-Blade being met by adaptations from the Caw-Blade players. However, this Caw-Blade deck was also one of the most skill-testing and rewarding decks to play. Strong players could easily differentiate themselves in the mirror match through their judgment. Despite any individual game being fun and engaging to play, though, the lack of strategic diversity was too much, and several important cards out of the deck were banned, removing the strategy from the metagame. There's a fundamental tension between fun and interactive gameplay and strategic diversity. An ideal metagame captures both, but balancing a game to reach both is difficult. To bring this back to Heroes of the Storm, point-and-click crowd control a la Valeera is generally considered unfun when it's good. However, it's also the best answer to low health pool heroes and can't be mitigated by mobility skills. By contrast, heroes like Tracer and Genji are very evidently skill testing, as their win rate climbs significantly with higher player skill. Keeping this tension in mind is important when discussing balance changes, as any balance change should ideally serve both functions, and if not, should be cognizant of the other. A big thing that this really alludes to is something that I, certainly as someone interested in educating about the game and content creation myself, I always grapple with, because it's very hard, is that yes, whenever you introduce skill-based heroes that based off of player skill can see vastly different performances, it ends up with having radically different metas across skill levels. I think that Tracer and Genji are an excellent example, where these heroes for the longest time have been overwhelmingly popular at pro level play and very, very dominant and powerful there. But they're so skill based that even when you knock it down to even, let's say, master level hero league, their win rates plummet very dramatically. And certainly once you go anywhere below master level play as well, they plummet even further. So you end up with a situation where a hero like Genji is one of the most picked assassins in pro level play, but sits at around something like a 40% win rate overall in Hero League, one of the lowest win rate heroes in the game overall. And there's two very big points that I would draw from this. The first one is for you guys, the viewers, right? Which is that, well, it does make it very difficult to learn or to understand or to have a good knowledge of what heroes are going to be powerful at your particular skill level. And the classic thing is that you still see, let's say, silver players pick Genji all the time, expecting Genji to be very powerful because when they turn on pro level play, they see the hero being played all the time. When in fact, that's not true at all. And in fact, a bunch of heroes that might be absolutely terrible at pro level play or see almost no play can actually be the strongest ones at those particular levels. They're completely different metagames. The level of player ability and skill is so different across all the different leagues that it can mean that different heroes, I would say different strategies, but like I said, I don't feel like there is all that much strategy into the higher tiers, if not the highest tier only, right? But certainly the heroes that you would pick, I think that varies drastically. And it can really destabilize the game quite a lot as well and make balancing quite difficult, I would think, for the developers when you do have very popular heroes actually being very weak just simply because they are skill-based heroes. The other difficulty, of course, is just in terms of game balance. How do you balance the game to keep it interesting? Here's the thing, right? This is also something that World of Warcraft players, I'd say, will certainly be much more familiar with, which is, okay, we have to make every hero balanced. We can't have, or we don't want to have a certain hero just be straight up better than others. That's just not good. Now, it happens a lot more in HOTS than it does in WoW because, well, I think in WoW there's 36 specs, whereas in HOTS there's, I don't know how many exactly, but 80 plus heroes. It's much more complicated. There's a lot more tuning knobs to be turned. But here's the thing, like when you look at WoW, all the specs have to perform roughly similarly. So here's the thing, why would you bother playing a harder spec when you can play an easier spec, when you can play an easier class, an easier hero that effectively achieves, it has the same outcomes, it does the same things, it does just as much damage, it achieves just as much. Why would you bother picking the thing that's harder? It might be fun, but you're putting yourself at a disadvantage because doing something that's harder for the same rewards is just not very smart. So that definitely brings a big level of complexity as well then to Heroes of the Storm. Because, well, we do want to have these skill-based heroes because they're fun and it's good to have your skill recognized. But then they can completely invalidate. If you let someone's skill be recognized too much, those heroes can then completely invalidate other heroes. And then this leads to a balancing nightmare. And I think, again, Genji is such a great example because you've got this hero, Genji, who is a very skill-based hero. And in order to have him just not completely dominate and destroy everything at pro level play, they have to nerf him so much that the hero is very, very underpowered. When you look at, let's say, again, like I said, silver or gold, it's about 70% of the Hero League player base. And the Hero League player base is, I would think, better than the quick match or the versus AI player base, for example, right? But that player base, I mean, Hero League is going to be the best of the non-professional game modes in terms of player competency, one would assume. Even in silver and gold, though, in that Hero League game mode, Genji's underpowered just because of how that skill-based formula essentially affects how they have to balance them in order to make it work for pro level play. So it's a massive fundamental tension in how the game is designed. It's a huge problem, I think. Well, depends whether you think it's a problem or not, but certainly it's a huge feature of game design for a game like HOTS because here's the thing, right? You have to have good game balance for your esport because your esport is a massive part of your advertising. It's also a massive part of engagement for a lot of players. Players across all skill levels, a lot of players very much enjoy watching the esports. So it has to be well balanced for that to make it competitive and interesting. But in order to make it competitive and interesting at an esports level, it can result when you go down to these other levels where the gameplay, the meta is so totally different. It can result in a lot of heroes just being useless because of that. You're trying to balance the game to be played in two very, very different ways. And that's just purely looking at, let's say, silver and gold versus HGC. And then you add in, quick match, you add in, versus AI, you add in unranked draft, you add in all the other levels of play in Hero League as well. It becomes much more complicated. And I think you can sort of see how game balance can actually be very difficult to get right, and how easy it can be for a hero to emerge as super overpowered at any given level of play and to start to mess up the experience for those particular people, probably a very large group of people, just because of trying to balance it across all these multiple different areas. Moving on with the article about OP heroes. Earlier this year, Phoenix and Maiev dominated Hero League while significantly impacting HGC, causing massive community outcry, not just about the state of those two heroes, but also about every other issue. Oh, God. Yeah, when something's wrong, all the naysayers come out, right? But while Blizzard was unusually slow to seriously nerf both of these heroes, the community deserves its own fair share of the blame. Expectations for emergency nerfs before the 2-week dev cycle for the balance patch are unreasonable, as the Blizzard development team does its best work when they can follow a routine. Keeping consistent schedule of alternating between content and balance patches every 2 weeks gives the devs room to breathe and work on what they need to. With the recent addition of more bans to draft modes, this shouldn't prove to be too major of an issue going forward, as now OP heroes don't completely deny the team going second one of their preliminary bans. Yeah, I think that the second point here is what I want to touch on first, because that is a big deal. It's a really big deal. The fact that, there are now 2 bans at the start of the draft, it takes a lot of pressure off this sort of thing. The thing that still bothers me is that, we know Quick Match is the most played game mode in the game. It is. It's the biggest one. It's the most popular one. when you have a hero that is drastically OP, or even drastically underpowered, a new hero as well, and they're left in that state for 2 weeks, it can make for a very negative game experience for people in those non-draft modes. Like I said, draft modes now, it's not that big of a deal because you have 2 bans, but in those non-draft modes, you go into a game and you're going, oh my god, this new hero came out and they're absolutely rubbish and they're on our team. We're at a big disadvantage. This sucks. Or alternatively, oh, well, the enemy team has, let's say, release state Phoenix, who's super overpowered, and it's just everyone knows it and it's extremely obvious. And every time you log on to play your game, for 2 weeks, you keep running into that problem over and over again. Which team has the Phoenix? Well, that team is going to have a massive advantage. That's just not very fun, in my opinion. Basically, how I feel about it, because it is a very fair point, right? That having a routine, having time to work on this stuff, that set 2 week time after hero comes out, that they'll release that balance patch, it does make the balancing that they do able to be more consistent. I think Zarya was a great example. Zarya was released and Zarya was absolutely terrible. And then the devs came out and they emergency buffed her. They gave her a whole load of buffs very, very quickly to try to get her to be, actually not totally rubbish, which they didn't want for a new hero, especially in Overwatch 1, because that's such an important marketing thing for them, right? But they buffed her way too much and then she became ridiculously strong and then had to be nerfed all the way back down. In my opinion, it was a total mess. The hero went from being probably the worst in the game to probably the best in the game very quickly. And it was a bit of a disaster, right? That's just changing something too fast and not quite getting it right. Certainly how I feel, I think when you have a new release hero, if they are, or a rework, and they are obviously overpowered or obviously underpowered, and I think you could set a bar saying either they have a over 60%, under 40% win rate, possibly over 55, under 45, maybe 58, 42, whatever it happens to be, but pick a mark and have that be the consistent routine thing, and then say, okay, coming up to the end of the week, we have this hero that we just released. They're sitting at a 62% win rate. That's clearly overpowered. Let's just put a simple set of tweaks in, like reduce, I don't know exactly what would be good here. I'm not good at math stuff, right? But let's say, hypothetically, let's knock 5% off their HP and damage, whatever. Just a small nerf. It's just a fairly consistent thing that just brings that hero down. The downside, of course, I think the main objection to this is that then instead of the devs at the end of the 2 weeks being able to sit down and put forward some very, very good changes, some strategic changes to the hero's kit, having gathered 2 weeks of data, instead you would be splitting it up into 1 week plus 1 week, where you got 1 week of them being at their original overpowered or underpowered state, and then 1 week at the slightly tweaked state. I don't know how much of an issue this would be, though, certainly because you would think some of the best data would come from all the draft modes. You've got so many other factors that factor into, like, quick match, for example. But here's the thing, if a hero is super OP, they're just going to be banned in every draft mode game anyway. So you might not even have that much data. You might have more and better data if you give them like a sizable, but still probably not anywhere near crippling nerf. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. I personally think I don't see any particular problems really. Certainly I'd be interested to hear more about it from people that might know more about the whole maths and data gathering and analysis side of the things. But it would seem to me as a layperson that would be a pretty reasonable way to go about it that would reduce frustration. Next point, newer versus older heroes. There seems to be a general sentiment going beyond the top OP heroes that the meta is stagnant and boring. Unfortunately, hero balance is hard, and as outlined in my metagame remarks above, trying to make every hero viable is an even harder one. Vague uneasiness about the state of balance is a legitimate feeling, but not one that leads to terribly productive discussion. Yeah, this idea of every hero being viable is something that, it's a sentiment I run into all the time. Basically, if I ever do a video where I talk about certain heroes being strong and or weak, it's almost guaranteed at least one person will say, well, no, every hero is viable, which is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how it works. It's this bizarre thing where I don't know how you would even commit to that point of view. It's just bizarre that you think that, I don't know, that the game is so simple or that the devs have so much time that they could take 80 plus heroes with every given patch, with every single set of changes, and ensure that every hero is totally equal. And they never make a single mistake. I don't know how you fully follow that one. I feel like it's probably like something of a political theory tie over from real life, right? Where, you know, a real commitment to like equality amongst human beings, that everyone is just as important as everyone else, gets carried over into a game going, well, then every hero must be equally as good as every other hero. And that it's some sort of moral crime if it's not the case. It's a bit weird, but obviously it's not true in HOTS, right? Is that there is a meta for a reason. Different heroes at different levels of play are stronger for a reason, and sometimes they can be dramatically stronger, dramatically weaker. I would say, I think probably going into it and having, 40 to 50% of the heroes being very, very, very viable, being very reasonable picks at any given time is a pretty good place to be. So yeah, okay, half of the heroes are a little bit undertuned or perhaps even really terrible. I am actually pretty fine with that. Then, of course, is the idea of the meta being stagnant. That's also an interesting thing there, where it might be worthwhile then, looking at those weaker heroes fairly regularly and trying to make them more relevant. So kind of the game would cycle then around having, okay, well, yeah, we're going to have, let's say, out of the 80 heroes, maybe about 40 at a given time that are very solid picks. And we're going to try to change those 40 regularly. So some of the 40 that are good right now might, in a while, kind of fall out of favor and not be that good anymore. But we'll have new heroes that are going to come out of the slightly underpowered or slightly irrelevant pile. We're going to take a look at them and bring them back into the fold. So there's a constant stream of heroes that are fun. I like Raynor is a great example, right? Raynor was so old that we just didn't really see much, if any, Raynor play at all for ages. Then the Raynor rework came out, and then Raynor is back, and he's like a mainstay of gameplay in HOTS at the moment. I would say in Raynor's case they made him too strong, but I think just fundamentally it's a good idea that hero that's just never seeing any play gets a fresh coat of paint and then comes back in. I think that's pretty nice. So that's kind of what I have to say about that. An important note here is that the HGC meta is its own beast, made by teams that are all on voice comms, practice for hours together to build trust and experience, and are playing at a very high level. Just because Genji does well in HGC doesn't mean he's any good in Hero League, where he struggles even at master ranks. Higher skill players and coordinated teams can abuse abilities like sanctification in ways that even Diamond games could only dream of. So no, while Alarak may have had 0 picks so far, that doesn't mean he's a bad hero for everyone else's games. There are legitimate balance concerns, but measuring every hero by HGC viability means you may be dismissing legitimate strategies for your skill level, while overvaluing ones that require a team that practices for 8 hours a day to pull off. That basically talks about, I talked about a lot of that stuff earlier. That's ChaosOS. You're probably saying it better and more concisely than I did. Staying on the topic of hero balance and design, there's also a sense that mobility has gotten out of hand. Without doing a full analysis to examine the truths of this idea, Blizzard has moved forward with normalizing several of the outlier heroes, even if prominent community members continue to argue that not enough has been done. The problem here is one of design, as Blizzard in 2017 sought to make the game more competitive and esports friendly. Historically, the Heroes community has complained that individual skill didn't matter enough. To rectify this, Blizzard has focused on creating skill-testing heroes like Tracer, Genji, and Li Ming, whose mobility and damage output allow single players to make the plays. Many of these frustrations are transformed into general complaints about Overwatch heroes due to the prominence of Genji and Tracer in Overwatch merchandising. This is an unfair accusation, as while Overwatch as a game certainly emphasizes mobility skills compared to other FPS, the cast represented in Heroes of the Storm isn't purely made up of heroes with 50 blinks and permanent invulnerability. Rather, it is the prominence and flashiness of Tracer and Genji that draws excessive attention, compared to heroes like Zarya and Ana, neither of whom feature significant mobility. Yeah, so there's a bunch of things going on in these couple of paragraphs. Again, I think the first paragraph here really draws the attention to, it's just the trade-offs of game design. So, people want, for the esports side of it, for sure, and even for just the competitive side of the game, to have more heroes that let you show off your individual skill. Well, what happens when you bring those heroes in and you make heroes that have that ability? Well, like you said, looking at Genji or Tracer in particular in the last while, these heroes then become the receiving end of an awful lot of hate, an awful lot of hatred, because they can do these flashy things. Like I said, it's a big trade-off. Either you get rid of heroes that allow for these higher skill level plays and that can do these cool things, and the game might be more fair and easier to balance, right? There's just an easier baseline to work off of, but it might be kind of less exciting to watch. It's what trade-off do you want? What's better? And it's hard to say, because I think the community right now will be like less of these crazy heroes, whereas the community, like you said, last year wanted more of them. Grass is always greener on the other side, maybe. Also, it's a very fair point. I love when people complain about Overwatch heroes. It's like, wait, are you complaining about Ana? What mobility does Ana have? She doesn't have any mobility. What are you even talking about? She's got that talent at level 7 that makes her move slower, right? I think that's still what it does. So yeah, it's obviously a pretty bad generalization to talk about Overwatch heroes. It's not particularly helpful. It's just convenient, and people like convenience. But the main thing I want to draw attention to in this paragraph is it's the prominence and the flashiness. Flashiness is a huge thing. I've talked about this a lot in the past. But let's say, for example, I mean, like, even looking at just the Overwatch heroes, right? So Tracer Genji versus, let's say, Zarya. I think for most levels of Hero League play, I think if you said which of these heroes is, let's take Gold Hero League play. Okay, Gold level Hero League play. Which one of these heroes was the most powerful? Like, if you looked at the entire history of the game, I think, and I'm not 100% sure because I don't have the statistics, but my remembrance of it is that Zarya was the most powerful of these all at that particular level of play, because Zarya was extremely overpowered at one stage. And the thing is, Zarya is not super flashy. Getting killed by Zarya, well, actually, I personally find it quite annoying with the Zarya shielding thing. If your teammates keep hitting the shield and then you're getting wrecked by the supercharged Zarya, I find that incredibly frustrating myself. I find that much more frustrating than I've ever found Tracer or Genji. But that's not an opinion that most people seem to share anyway. But yeah, I guess what Zarya does is just a lot less flashy. It's not as noticeable as this ninja, just ninja striking on top of you and throwing shuriken in your face, and he's jumping around, and it's very stylish. So people react very powerfully to that. I mean, Li Ming was brought up in that first paragraph. That's another hero that when she works well, like goes off in a team fight and they're getting lots of resets, it's extremely flashy, and she can do a ton of damage in that small amount of time. That's what people notice. They really pick up on it. But basically, heroes that will do immense amounts of, that will still be as OP, if not more OP. You could have a hero with a much more stifling, a much more oppressive win rate, a much more oppressive presence in the game. But if that hero doesn't do it in as bursty, as flashy of a way, if they do it at a much slower pace, Zul was another example. Zul was also crazy overpowered. But we didn't have anywhere near the amount of complaints about Zul as we did about Li Ming. It's because they don't do it in as dramatic a way. And when people look at the game and try to figure out what's too strong or what's too weak, it's typically stuff that is visually striking that gets taken to be strong, when that might not necessarily be the case at all. So it's difficulty in getting good community feedback on that case, because oftentimes the heroes people complain about aren't actually that good. I mean, again, people complain about Genji all the time. People hate Genji despite him sitting at some like 40 something, a terrible win rate in Hero League, but people hate him, even though it's probably a large advantage. Even let's say you're a gold player, it's probably a very large advantage if your enemy team picks up the Genji, but people will still complain about him non-stop, because when he does actually do something useful, which is on the whole, compared to the other potential heroes that he could pick, relatively rare, but when he does do something impactful, it's flashy and it stands out and you notice it. And that leads to some really bad feedback and some really bad analysis, in my opinion. And finally then, let's talk about the pace of changes. Disclaimer, the following section gives times based on the US West Coast, as that is where Blizzard is located. Please mentally adjust for wherever in the world you are located. To cap this discussion of balance changes and design, there have been a number of complaints about the pace of balance changes. Part of this is that the community hasn't caught onto when the developers make changes. Every 3 to 4 weeks, Blizzard releases a content patch to the PTR mid-morning on Monday, which typically contains a new hero and/or hero reworks. After a week, Blizzard pushes the PTR patch to the live servers on Tuesday morning with minimal balance changes, instead fixing whatever bugs appeared on the PTR, plus occasionally a few more. 2 weeks after this content patch, Blizzard releases a balance patch on Wednesday to tune whatever content was just released, plus some changes to adjust for the meta. For 3-week content cycles, this week also has a PTR patch on Monday. For 4-week content cycles, the PTR patch comes the Monday following the Wednesday balance patch. While Heroes of the Storm is a video game, the developers are working modern software jobs. This entails that they receive benefits like time off, work as a team in development cycles, and are beholden to business interests. Furthermore, devs are people too, citation needed, which means they have feelings and care about their work product. Calling the dev team lazy is wildly unproductive and selfish. More reasonably, any discussion about emergency patches must keep in mind software development cycles. Pushing changes to the live server costs network engineer time and comes with service uptime risks. So I mean, I fully agree with this stuff here. I think it's very good to point out because I do think people don't really fully sit down and realize and do jump to some conclusions. I mentioned a lot of this when I was talking earlier, just to reiterate one of my main points I made earlier. Certainly in terms of the balance patch based off of new hero releases from PTR, I personally don't think that a 2-week wait is good. Or at least in extreme circumstances where heroes are obviously overpowered or underpowered, I think it would be wise for Blizzard to be able to have a setup so that they're able to deal with that. Like they can anticipate it. If it does happen that you release a hero with a 60% plus win rate across multiple levels, if not all levels of play, it's very obvious that they're too strong. And then to be able to, have a consistent system, like I suggested, 5% HP damage nerf, healing, whatever, spell power nerf. Just pop that in after 1 week. Pretty simple to implement. Not that difficult, I think, but could be good for the game overall. And certainly in terms of talking on pace of changes, I mean, one of the big questions, I guess the bigger question here is not so much whether, for the most part, the pace of the changes is good, but it's probably in terms of, okay, like every 2 weeks, you got that balance patch after PTR, but whether the stuff that gets covered in it is the right stuff, whether enough gets covered, and for example, how long it takes for older, less relevant heroes to get looked at. So let's say, for example, the Lost Vikings right now. They obviously haven't been touched in a very, very long time. They're obviously not I would guess they're maybe the least popular hero in the game. Not 100% sure on that. I could check, but I won't bother. But one of the least popular heroes in the game. They don't see all that much play. And when you look at them and their talent design, it's obviously extremely outdated. You've got a bunch of band-aid fixes to certain talents, as simply the game has changed so much around them that things like sabotage, whatever it's called for Vikings, it's just a complete band-aid fix. It's not actually been properly looked at. When will they get looked at? Is that the right amount of time? Is it appropriate considering all the other things? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there as I think a fairly clear example of something that obviously ought to be changed in the future, but it's the question of when that ought to be done. And on the whole, it is difficult to say as well. This is what I came back to, going back to what I was talking about at the very start, where you have multiple different levels of the metagame, where different heroes are very, very different at different levels of play. Because in my experience, I would certainly say when I'm being a very active player, let's say I'm playing, several Hero League games a day, playing a few hours every day, certainly by the time you're coming, certainly by the end of the first week of a balance, let's say a 2-week balance patch deal, certainly by the end of the first week, it's typically extremely obvious which heroes are too strong, which talents are too strong, and you want them to be changed, and then you're waiting an extra amount of time. So I would say, from my perspective, I would think that for active players at any particular level, you want those changes to come in faster. But I suspect a lot of the difficulty comes and why they have to be slower. So let's say, okay, let's say you're a Master GM player, which is typically what I've played at. after a week, you want these changes. It's clear what should be done. The thing is, though, it's making sure that those changes won't have a massive effect on all the other levels of play. I suspect that's the biggest problem. And it's really tough. This is also why I've been quite passionate too about changing quick match to make sure that each team has a tank and each team has a healer, because I don't think that has any particular negative effect on quick match. And by streamlining basically how the game effectively really ought to be played, just based off of what most of the player base are doing, and certainly the esports thing, just by streamlining it, because they can't change the esports really, or they're certainly not, as far as I know, they're not planning to in the near future in terms of that sort of stuff, the whole tank and healer deal. Better to just streamline quick match and make it follow the same rules, because if they simplify it that way, it becomes a lot easier to balance heroes around. So for example, a hero that is expected to be countered by a healer, by a support type character, let's say even assassin, let's say like Valera or something like that, and in order to survive Valera, you're expected to have a healer nearby that can keep you alive. That's like her weakness, it's her counterplay. Well, if you're going into all assassins in quick match, then actually balancing it so that Valera doesn't completely ruin that level of play, while also still being relevant when her counter is there in draft modes, well, that's very tough. So why bother? Just get rid of that outlier, because you can't really change the esports that much. So just streamline the quick match side, make the balancing stuff simpler, because it's already hard enough as it is. Anyway, guys, that was looking at the first half of this article here by ChaosOS. Again, I encourage you guys to pop over and read the article yourself. I will probably come back. Let me know if you like this video. If you guys do, if there's good feedback, I'll certainly come back with part 2. Maybe part 3. I'll probably try to do part 2 and try to go through faster, and we'll see how we do, whether it needs to go into 3 parts. But yeah, I'll come back and I'll talk about some of the further stuff where he's looking at things like Hero League features, matchmaking, hero swaps, player-based knowledge, role revamps, Grandmaster / Master gameplay, placement game, performance-based matchmaking, reports, toxicity, lots of stuff like that. So yeah, thumbs up if you liked it, guys. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you all next time for some more Heroes of the Storm. Bye-bye.